My name is Christina Proenza-Coles, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, American Founders: How People of African Descent Established Freedom in the New World. I'm from Miami, Florida, and my mom is from Savannah, Georgia, and my dad was from Cuba, from Holguin, Oriente Province. So I grew up in the American South and in the Caribbean, and I was always very curious about the connections between the two regions. For example, Bahamians, who can trace their ancestors to the Gullah communities in South Carolina because of enslaved ancestors who were able to obtain their own freedom and make it to Florida and then settle in the Caribbean in the 1820s and 30s. So it was stories like these that made me really curious about these interconnections and ties between different regions in the Americas. So I studied history and I studied sociology, and I became professor of the Atlantic world and the African diaspora. And every year I taught classes. I taught world history, US history, Latin American history, Atlantic world history. And every year as I prepared for a new semester and updated the syllabi and did research, I continually came across the stories of extraordinary things that Black men and women had done for American history. Men and women who had fought in revolutions, who had started independence movements, people who had founded political organizations, schools, newspapers, businesses, men and women who had innovated technology, people who had risked their lives and given their lives for the development of democracy. And the number of individuals was truly overwhelming. And cumulatively, they fundamentally changed how I understand American history and the development of American democracy in particular. So I wrote American Founders, which is filled with thousands and thousands of Afro-descended men and women who did extraordinary things to advance American history. So I can only speak about a few of them here, but cumulatively their stories have three key themes. The first is that multiculturalism is not politically correct. It's historically accurate. Africans arrived a century before the English. They arrived on the ships of the Spanish. They arrived on the ships of Columbus. So American history is African and European. It's Anglo and Latin, fundamentally intertwined, inextricable histories. The second theme is that most Americans arrived in the New World as slaves. And I say that because before 1820, 3 times as many Africans arrived in the Americas as Europeans. And that's, of course, because of the Atlantic slave trade, the largest demographic shift in world history that forced some 12 million individuals from one continent to another. But even though these individuals arrived involuntarily, and even though they were denied rights, enslaved people were Americans. Americans who shaped our history at every turn, from the most mundane daily activities to the most watershed important events in our history. The third theme is that enslaved Americans and free people of color were on the forefront of struggles for democracy and to end slavery throughout the Americas and throughout history. So American Founders, it proceeds chronologically and it covers all of the Americas. It begins in the 1500s and continues chapter by chapter, century by century, up into 1950. But the first chapter is called Slavery in a World Historical Perspective, and it's meant to orient the reader in terms of how unique New World slavery was. Slavery was, of course, practiced in all of the civilizations of the ancient world, starting in ancient Sumer, where about 50% of the population was enslaved. And slavery was a practice in every part of the globe, and it was justified by the rules of war and the rules of religion. What is truly novel and unprecedented in New World, modern American slavery, was the sheer scale of the enterprise, mass production for mass consumption. But also, this was the first time in world history that race was invented to justify the slave system. So chapter 2 starts in the 1500s. It looks at 16th century Afro-American conquistadors. As I mentioned before, there were African-descended people on the ships of Columbus, but the first record of enslaved Africans in the New World goes back to 1502 in what is today the Dominican Republic, what the Spaniards called Hispaniola. These first enslaved Africans immediately liberated themselves. They ran away and they joined with the native communities and resisted the Spanish planters, which was a pattern that it was repeated throughout the Americas and throughout American history. You may be familiar with the story of a Spanish sugar planter named Ayllón, who attempted to start the first permanent settlement in North America in Georgia in 1526. He arrived with about 600 colonists from Hispaniola and about 100 enslaved African men and women. And the colony was a disaster. Ayllón died, as did many of the colonists. Otherwise, they returned to Hispaniola. But the African individuals mutinied and joined with the indigenous communities in eastern Georgia, which is interesting to think about because it means that the first permanent Old World settlers in what becomes the United States were not the English at Jamestown, but in fact, African men and women. I want to single out an Afro-Mexican man named Juan Valiente, who was enslaved in Mexico in the colonial period. And by the way, in many parts of the colonial Americas, Africans outnumbered Europeans in colonial Mexico and also in colonial South Carolina. So Juan Valiente was enslaved, and he requested permission from his master to join with a conquest mission to Chile. And he was granted permission, and his service was so valiant, hence the name John Brave, and meritorious, the Spanish crown granted him his freedom and an estate. And Juan Valiente eventually married Juana de Valdivia, who had been formerly enslaved by the colony's governor, and together they went on to live in freedom and raise a family. Chapter 3 of American Founders looks at 17th century Afro-American colonials. And this chapter is filled with cowboys and pirates, so it's a lot of fun. But I'm going to turn to the next chapter, which looks at Afro-American revolutionaries of the 18th century. And there's so many revolutionary actors we could talk about, from Bacon's Rebellion to the Stoner Revolt in South Carolina, to Jamaica's Maroon Wars, to the Haitian Revolution, which of course established the first free republic in the Americas, to all the independence wars in Latin America in which Afro-descended individuals disproportionately fought. But I want to focus on the American Revolution. You may be familiar with the many African-American patriots who served the American Revolution. Also, there were Afro-Cuban and Afro-Mexican patriots who served along the Gulf Coast under the Spanish governor of Louisiana. And you may be familiar with the Afro-Haitian patriots who fought along the American patriots in the Siege of Savannah. Today, there's a memorial in downtown Savannah that you may be familiar with. But I want to focus for a moment on an enslaved Afro-Virginian named James Armistead, who volunteered, got permission from his master to serve as a double agent during the American Revolution. He infiltrated the camps of the British, of Benedict Arnold and Lord Cornwallis, and would bring the information back to General Lafayette. So it was James Armistead's intelligence that helped Lafayette orchestrate and indeed win the battle at Yorktown that established American independence. James Armistead requested his freedom from the Commonwealth of Virginia and received it. And in fact, Virginia created a Manumission Act in 1783 that freed enslaved patriots who had served in the American Revolution because, in the words of the act, that these individuals had contributed to the establishment of American liberty and independence. So when I got to the 19th century, there were so many African-descended patriots and liberators and nationals that I had to split it up into two chapters. And I'm sure you're familiar with the story of Robert Smalls of South Carolina, who during the American Civil War was able to commandeer a Confederate ship to Union lines, served as a Union naval captain for the remainder of the war, and then returned to South Carolina, where he was elected to the House of Representatives. You may be less familiar with the story of William Gould. I was not familiar with the story until his grandson, William Gould IV, who's a professor of law at Stanford University, came to speak about his great-grandfather at Virginia State University, where I was teaching. So William Gould I was an enslaved plasterer in Wilmington, North Carolina. And during the American Civil War, he and 7 other enslaved Americans orchestrated their escape along the Cape Fear River, some 26 miles. And Gould then served with the Union Navy for the remainder of the war. And all 6 of his sons followed their father into military service for the U.S. 5 of his sons defended democracy in World War I, and one served in the Spanish-American War, the war to help liberate Cuba from Spain. And in fact, there were many African-American soldiers who fought alongside Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War in Cuba. And if there are any jazz or bebop fans out there, Dexter Gordon's grandfather was among them. He was awarded a Medal of Honor for saving a drowning soldier under heavy fire. But this story of enslaved people liberating themselves and then fighting for the rights of others happens throughout the Americas over and over again, and throughout the wars for independence in Latin America, from Mexico to Chile to Argentina to Cuba. And Cuba has a very well-known national hero, the great Afro-Cuban General Antonio Maceo, who fought for Cuban independence. Less well-known is the story of his mother, Mariana Grajales, who during Cuba's wars of independence would drag soldiers off the battlefield and treat them in her hospital. She's just one example of the many thousands of Black women patriots who fought for the independence and freedom of their nation. So I'm going to wrap up with the final chapter, which focuses on the 20th century. I look at the beginnings of the civil rights movement pre-1950, starting in the 1900s. In fact, the entire book is an argument for the idea that men and women of African descent did not begin to step onto the political stage to fight for their rights and the rights of others in the 1950s. This began in the 1500s. But this chapter in particular zeroes in on men and women in the first half of the 20th century who fought for democracy throughout the Americas. But today I'll close with a figure you may have been hearing about in the news lately, Charlotta Bass. She was the first African-American woman who was nominated for the vice presidency of the United States in 1952. She was from South Carolina and moved to California, where she ran a newspaper from about 1912 to 1951. And Charlotta Bass was a tireless champion for democracy and spoke out repeatedly against discrimination in housing, against discrimination in policing, and against discrimination in hiring. She was a champion of rights for women, for Asian Americans, for Latin Americans. Today, the U.S. National Park Service website describes Charlotta Bass as an American hero, and she certainly was, and she was among many hundreds of thousands of African-descended men and women who fought heroically to put the ideals of our democracy into practice. I'll just close with a final thought, which is that slavery and its fallout, discrimination, has affected and continues to affect the lives of every American. But to me, what's important about these stories and American founders is that it shows that we are all connected and linked together in this complicated history. And I hope that despite the fact that as a nation, we have often separated ourselves brutally and violently and sometimes more subtly and imperceptibly, I hope that American founders might encourage us to learn more about our shared history and our shared American identity that is white and Black, that is Anglo and Latin, and that was born out of freedom and slavery, and to recognize and build upon a shared past that connects us more than it divides. Thanks for your time.